a name taught to behave.
As it was, so the door can open later.
Continuity can feel like anesthesia until you hear the 13th.
Rivers keep their verbs, erode, deposit, argue.
Not miracles. Editing. Memory returns.
For the next 2 hours, you will have a story and a gentle descent into sleep.
Sleep now, my love, the stars are bright.
If this quiet work matters, leave a small trace. Say, remember.
Before we begin, take a slow breath in and out. If you're comfortable, let your eyes grow heavy and your curiosity stay awake. What you're about to hear is a quiet testimony, told like a documentary and paced for sleep. We'll move gently, one locked door at a time. If anything feels too bright, let it pass like a candle behind a curtain. When you're ready, we'll listen together and remember what tried to be forgotten. I did not plan to confess tonight. I planned to sleep like a decent man who has folded his life into quiet drawers, each labeled with a date and a prayer. But sleep has a way of questioning my catalogs. It detaches the labels and lets them drift like ash in a chapel's light. Which is why I'm speaking softly, yes, but speaking because silence was never holy in the places I served. Silence was enforced. Before we begin, let me tell you about the keys. They were presented to me on a winter evening when Rome smelled of wet stone and old bread. Each key lay in a velvet tray, numbered without numbers, an archaic notation, more geometry than arithmetic, as if each tooth corresponded to a star the church had once erased from the public sky. You cannot understand what I did, or what I failed to do, without understanding that weight in my hand. Brass cooled by the night, the edges nicked by centuries, the stems engraved with spirals that did not resolve. People imagine the Vatican's secrets live on the shelves. They envision long corridors of chained books, yes, and vellum that sighs when you lift it, and a librarian who never looks up from his ledger. They see staircases that narrow the deeper they go, and guards who become less human as the air thins and the candles give less permission to the dark. All of that exists. And yet, the shelves are not the secret, any more than the shoreline is the sea. The shelves are the mask the secret wears to be seen and not seen, catalogued and never consulted. The real secret was a room that was not on the plan, though plans were my business then, and I knew them the way a monk knows the margins of his favorite psalm. On the official drawing, a blank space appeared where the stairs should have met a dead wall, a void of ink. In the annex ledger, the space was labeled air, just that, as if the architect had shrugged and the church had nodded, and the angels had looked away. We called it the door that never opened, because the hinges turned inward, but past them the air did not behave like air, and space did not behave like space, and time. Time stopped volunteering its usual courtesies. I had not intended to open it. I am not the sort of man who seeks monsters under a holy bed. My training was to preserve, to file, to sign witness on the spines of our lives. I saw this. It existed. I arranged it so others may find it without finding too much. A librarian of obedience. The day they gave me the keys, I promised to use them only in the service of legibility. That is the oath, though we never wrote it so plainly, not to truth, which is unwieldy, but to legibility, which can be printed, bound, and placed where sunlight finds it. So why am I confessing? Because I learned there are rooms where legibility is a kind of vandalism, and others where silence is an instrument, and still others where both become the same act because the witness is not a person but a relic, and the testimony is not speech but light. In such rooms, a key is never a mere key. It is permission made metal. You want a beginning. Every testimony must have one, or else we are only murmuring in a corridor, and no one can cite us. Very well. The beginning was a bell that should not have rung. It came after Compline, when the city above was closing its lids and the fountains were forgetting themselves. The bell was small, more a palate cleanser for the air than a command, and it struck 13 times in a patient rhythm. I knew that sound from a machine-whispered rumor. A clock without currency, mounted in a room without a name. The 13th stroke was not a number at all, but an I. I had the keys. I had insomnia that crept like ivy through my catechism, and I had an invitation that wasn't written, but which every step downward made more legible. Come, observe. Be the scribe who can be trusted to write what will never be read. The stairs to the subcrypt are the kind that test your belief in sequence. Descend long enough, and you start to think someone miscounted centuries ago, and no one has had the courage to fix the chisels. 12 comes before 9 down there. The walls remember floods rumored out of Scripture. The mortar smells of beeswax and old thunder. I learned to breathe shallowly so the air wouldn't revise me. The candles along the way do not flicker like candles. They dim the way a memory does when you tell it to behave. At the landing, I found the chained books, yes, but not as the tourists imagine. There were chains, iron and honest, but they were not to prevent theft. They were to prevent movement migration. To be precise, because some ideas are migratory, and if you do not tether them, they molt and join new spines, and you wake up to find yesterday's doctrine nesting in today's ledger. Librarians up there laugh at that sentence. Librarians down here do not. On the left, a cabinet of reliquaries. I will be plain, they speak. Rarely in words, language is our vanity, but in a way that convinces your bones you just heard a noun where none was uttered. Bone splinters, wood slivers, scraps of silk cut cleanly with a hesitation that never healed. The first time I passed, I did not dare to listen. The second time, I slowed to the pace of a prayer I had forgotten. The third time, I listened, and a thorn told me the year on my calendar was polite fiction. I was not afraid. Not then. Fear came later, with the office, with the type of knowledge that prays for thicker doors. In those first nights I felt only a terrible curiosity, the sense that if I could see the ledger behind our ledgers, the index behind our indexes, I would find a single heading in careful Roman hand index oblivionis, and under it, not books to be burned, but stories to be delayed. I told myself delay is a kindness. If history is a bright room, we cannot throw all the shutters at once. Some eyes need time. Some names need a corridor. This is the folly of decent men. We persuade ourselves that our caution is mercy. Perhaps it is. Perhaps the world would have shattered had we not softened it with filigree and calendar changes and redactions disguised as harmonies. Perhaps, but to test a perhaps, you need a door. The door that never opened is not an architectural marvel. That's the first trick. It doesn't glow or thunder, It is plain wood, dark with oils, proportioned to a mortal hand, the hinges asking for a familiar weight. It looks like every other door that keeps drafts from registers and whispers from thresholds. What distinguishes it is not the door, but the room that has insisted on making itself small so we might pretend not to fear it. I knew which key because the tray was missing one. The gap it left was shaped like an answer. The night bell had stopped. The subcrypt breathed, the way a vast cello takes breath when no one is watching. I turned the key. The lock did not resist, it considered. There's a sound wood makes when it remembers the tree. The door made that sound. Then it yielded, and the corridor behind me receded the way a shoreline recedes when a ship resolves to be honest. I will catalogue what I saw as an archivist would, because that is still the only way I can tell the truth without drowning. Room dimensions, indeterminate. The first pace is the same length as a father's patience. The second is the length of a story told only once and told well. After that, pace loses meaning. Fixtures, a crescent of wooden chairs facing an empty pedestal. No frescoes, no gold leaf, a clock without numerals, only marks for 12 hours, and then a 13th mark painted as an eye. Light with no obvious source, as if permission itself were luminous. Occupants, 3 robed figures seated with the dignity of unremarkable furniture. 2 scribes, at a narrow table, quills idle. 1 reliquary on the pedestal, closed. Myself, a shadow with a key still warm in his palm. Atmosphere, not solemn, not sinister. Procedural. You must understand this, or you will miss the danger. Evil likes spectacle. Control prefers minutes. The room felt like minutes drafted, circulated, initialed, filed. No one looked at me. No one asked why an archivist from ordinary shelves had presented himself for a session in a room that did not exist. Either they had been expecting me all my life, or I was so irrelevant to the proceedings that my presence did not need to be recorded. The scribes arranged their paper the way farmers arrange hay without hurry, with ritual affection. The presiding figure lifted a hand, whose gesture made the air adopt paragraphs. The reliquary did not open by hinges. It opened the way a thought unpins itself. A breath entered the room and then forgot to leave. Light developed facets, like a cut stone turning slowly in an unmoving hand. I do not mean a miracle. I mean a testimony. If you have never been in a room where light testifies, this will sound like poetry. I assure you, it is stenography. The kind the sky does when we make the mistake of thinking it is only weather. A voice spoke. Not sound more like the moment a candle gives its smoke your attention. A presence, then, shaped itself into mercy for our ears. It said, gently, as if waking us, "Do we proceed?" The presiding figure did not bow. He nodded, as one nods to a colleague already known and regretted. The scribe to his right inked his pen and asked for the record, name of the witness. The presence did not pretend to be human. "You have called me many names," it said, "and most of them were apologies. I answer to none. The nearest word you have is seraph." I had heard rumors. We all had. In the ranks where men wiser than me placed their hope in seals and sequestration, a fable had migrated. That there was a chamber where relics spoke, and sometimes an angel answered questions no person could be trusted to word. I had shelved it with the other coping mechanisms. Jokes, cigars, Latin, To hear it named without ceremony, and to hear the unhuman patience of it fill the room like a grammar for light, this, I confess, loosened something in my chest I had tightened since ordination. The session did not begin then, as a dramatist would place the cue. It had begun long before, in centuries we pretend to agree on. The scribe simply placed a date at the top of the page that had no relationship to the calendar upstairs, and the presiding voice asked, "State the first matter." "Time," the witness said, "the rind you removed to sweeten a bitter harvest. I will not transcribe the whole deposition here. That is for later chapters, when you are used to this pitch of quiet, when the facts can sit without shaking the table. For now, understand only this. The room did not exist to summon wonders like a spectacle. It existed to negotiate with memory, because memory is not a vault. It is a river. You can dam it, you can reroute it, but it wants its level, and it remembers where that is. When the session concluded, no gavel, only the soft etiquette of quills being laid to rest, the presiding figure extinguished the candles in a prescribed order, left, right, center. The clock's 13th mark seemed to listen, then blink, a courtesy. No one dismissed me because no one had acknowledged me. I took one backward step, as if returning a borrowed adjective. The door recognized the retreat. I should have left then. I should have reshelved myself among decent drawers. But curiosity, that old tax collector, counts backward. Before I could unlearn what I had witnessed, I walked past the reliquary cabinet, past the chained folios, past the atlas that kept daring the coastlines to disagree with us. I stopped at a shelf of what appeared to be calendars, not the public kind with saints and seasons, but the working kind that rooms use to synchronize their breath. They were redacted, not crudely, not with the arrogance of ink, but with the compassion of ash. Feast days smudged, annotations softened until they became the suspicion of script. Between 2 years, a splice so clean, I nearly admired it. Someone had performed surgery on time and left no scar except the ache people feel when they wake certain that a dream was a memory and find the morning does not consent. There was a slip of paper piety loves slips of paper wedged as a bookmark. It read, in a hand I would come to recognize as the room's own voice, "Quietar." To quiet, not erase, not abolish, quiet. That was the word that would trouble me for many nights and then all my days. Why am I telling you this now? Because confession is not a moral performance. It is logistics, a way of moving weight from a failing beam to a truer arch. I aged in that room. I grew careful. Care makes cowards of us. And then, quite suddenly, I grew tired. That is when decent men become dangerous, not when they rage, but when they are too weary to keep arranging the same deck of names so that the same game looks different to the untrained eye. I returned to the door that never opened on other nights. I learned its hours, which were not hours. I assisted in sessions, though no one ever asked my name. I copied the oath the scribes take, not to truth, which refuses formatting, but to legibility, which obeys margins. I began to suspect that our margins were throttling the page. There is a sound old paper makes when it wants to be leafed, and you insist on binding it tighter. It is not a sound for listeners, it is a sound for the conscience. This is a chapter, not a life. I must end before I begin to anticipate the questions you have not yet earned. For now, hold these: a bell that strikes 13, and an eye where a number should be. A door whose hinges turn inward, but the space beyond does not. a tribunal that calls itself a listening, a witness made of light that remembers without our permission, calendars smudged kindly, maps that refuse to sit still, and a word written in ash, quieter. If you are lying awake, you may feel, as I did, the sense that some part of the world has been told to sleep, and that part is in you. Breathe, and let your curiosity stay awake. We will move gently, one locked door at a time. I will speak as a man who once kept keys and now keeps matches. Do not worry about the dark. We will use only as much flame as the corridor needs. When I lift the next page, the reliquaries will murmur to the walls. They will say names softly, to reintroduce them to the air. And somewhere, a clock without numerals will blink its 13th mark. It is not a warning. It is an invitation. A small aperture in a large room where light crosses itself and remembers. You asked for a confession. Here is the first installment. I once held keys that were not meant to fit any door on earth, and I used them to enter a room that edits what the shelves will ever hold. The door never opened. It, like so many holy things, opened me. There are cities that publish their streets in sunlight, and cities that keep their streets folded inside, like letters never posted. The Vatican is the latter kind. Above ground, everything is polished into a choreography of marble and modesty. Below, it is a system of remembered mistakes, stairs cut at ratios no astronomer would approve, corridors that narrow as if they were ashamed of where they lead, rooms that pretend to be storage and, with the right breath, begin to confess. I learned the undercity in increments. As a child learns the house where adults whisper, you memorize what not to touch before you're taught what anything is for. Breathe shallow, Brother Matteo told me on my first sanctioned descent. He was the sort of man who hid cigarettes under his piety, the way a fisherman tucks a hook in his cap. The air edits you, if you let it in too quickly. He smiled like a priest who had seen too many miracles and learned to call them plumbing. The stairs themselves argued with arithmetic. Roman numerals, carved by men who believed stone could keep a secret. Xi gouged above Ix, as if numbers had slipped on damp mortar and no one dared scrape them back. When the flood stories were still wet, Matteo said, tapping the carved 12 with a fingernail browned by ink. A mason chiseled these steps wrong, and a bishop called it providence. Providence is just the name you give to stubborn accidents, yes? He said yes for me, like a teacher, and kept walking. The subcrypt met us with a smell that refuses description without sounding ludicrous. Candle soot, wet limestone, something like dried blood on calfskin, the metallic aftertaste of time. Candles do burn there, but they do not flicker. They decide. When we passed, their light retreated politely, then resumed its post, as if embarrassed to be caught illuminating what prefers to be dim. Along the first corridor, each book was chained to an iron rail, not with petty cruelty but with the resigned intelligence of an old gatekeeper who has seen too many ideas migrate in the night. The chains had the patina of worshipped artifacts. Matteo let me touch one link. They're not for thieves, he said. They're for the books. Some are habitués. Give them freedom, and they change sections without telling the catalog. And then, what will we do? Invent a patron saint of reshelving? He chuckled, then coughed, and that cough turned into a prayer before it reached his mouth. The books themselves were a topography of disobedience. Vellum, whose erased handwriting, palimpsest upon palimpsest, flickered through like constellations behind thin clouds. Margins annotated by obedient hands and in a different ink, by a hand that could not help itself. I wanted to read everything. That is how I knew I would be dangerous one day. Danger begins with wanting unmanaged context. At a wrought iron case, I met the reliquaries the way one meets the elderly, who were famous in a republic that no longer exists. Their gilt frames were less astonishing than the restraint with which they glowed. Slivers of bone, thumbnail curls of wood, threads of silk, a century per gram. The eye learns their etiquette. Do not stare as if in a zoo. Do not look away as if in contempt. Listen at an angle. The way you listen at a confessional booth when the penitent is not quite certain he's alone. One reliquary labeled in a hand that apologized for itself. From the thorn, provenance contested, cleared its throat. I say this knowing it sounds mad. It made a small change to the air, and the air condensed into meaning. The meaning was a date. The date was not the date I thought it was. "You are early," Matteo whispered, as if to the calendar. "Or we are late," I replied. The reliquary offered nothing further. They do not perform on command. They correct on opportunity. Between two cabinets stood a lectern supporting a folio, boxed in aged leather, edges blacked with either time or intent. Matteo lifted the lid and showed me a page that looked like a field, after carefully controlled burn. The text above scraped away, the undertext glowing like embers. "Read," he said. The visible script was a homily on obedience as a form of love. The script beneath was a gospel fragment, in a voice so unadorned that it frightened me. A woman told a story about remembering too clearly. In the palimpsest's underlight, she stepped forward and insisted on her verbs. Matteo closed the box gently. "We thread these things where they will not tear the fabric," he said. "We are tailors of the common waking. That is what they call us when they want to pat themselves on the back. Tailors. On other days the word is janitors. On nights like the one I am telling you about, the word is wardens. The job never changes, only the costume of our conscience." We continued toward a small room labeled RRU, on the ledger Reading Room of the Unread, and if a name ever deserved irony gilded in Latin, it was this. The RRU does not entertain patrons. It entertains the notion that some texts rest best in shadow. Bare shelves, a single table, 2 chairs that dared you to yawn. "If anything here yawns back," Matteo said, "we leave." I smiled until I understood he meant it. A map lay there, under glass, its inks faded to the color of second thoughts. Atlas Cartography in Dubio. The caption read, "The Cartographer's Atlas under review. Coastlines are stubborn creatures. They dislike being told where to stay." On this map, the stubbornness had been documented like a sin. Ports wandered a finger's width off their lawfully assigned bays. A river doubled back on itself in a manner that accused a king of impatience. "Once a city existed here," Matteo said, tapping a place the current official maps call ocean. "It did not drown, it was folded." I looked up sharply. "Folded?" Quietly, he said, "like a shirt. The cupboard is time." He paused, then, softer. "You think I'm being poetic. I'm not. Paper is the body of policy. When we fold paper, the world holds its breath." That was the first time I felt the Undercity change me. Not fright, not awe, a tilt. As if some internal gyroscope reluctantly acknowledged a different north. He taught me the oaths, not in the official chapel, but standing before the chained folios with the reliquaries, listening their privilege, the oath to legibility, to write in a hand that will not embarrass the future, to date with a calendar consistent with the present consensus, to file in a manner that the next obedient mind can reverse engineer without seeing the gap. No one mentions truth in the oath. Truth is the deep water. Legibility is the shallow. And men drown in the shallow more often because they refuse to believe they can. We rehearsed the protocol for candlelight. Left first, then right, then center, so the room's story would settle evenly without bias toward any margin. This is catalogued as superstition by those who have never seen a manuscript go sour after a prayer angled the wrong way. Laugh, if you like. The pages laugh back. They curl, they exhale oils that smell like gossip, they develop a film of sadness that you can taste like iron on your teeth. On my third week of sanctioned descent, I was assigned to escort a visitor, an elderly monsignor with the posture of an antique chess piece and a niece somewhere he loved too much to admit. His task: consult a calendar palimpsest that had resisted several previous harmonizations. My task: usher him past the reliquary cabinet without letting him be talked to. "Does one resist?" he asked as we passed the glass. "They prefer footnotes," I said, the safest answer. "And you?" he said. "I prefer minutes," I answered, and he nodded with the pity reserved for the young. "In the are you?" He read without moving his eyes, the way some men pray. "We took 13 days, he murmured, and blamed the sun. He meant the Gregorian reform, or what lay behind it. "The public loves a corrective that begins with the heavens," he said. "They forgive better if you tell them the planets demanded it." He turned a page with fingers that had held too many chalices. "It's always the planets or the pestilences, never the minutes." He set the palimpsest down and inhaled the room, as if trying to determine how long it had been since someone exhaled honesty here. After he left, Brother Matteo let me into a smaller annex lined with wooden drawers that did not open so much as change their minds. Here lived the Index Oblivionis, not as a single book but as a liturgy of cards, each the size of a photograph of a face. The cards were written in immaculate script by a scribe who must never have blinked. Each card contained a name, a date, a note of adjustment. Some entries were gentle, delay feast, 3 days for calendrical regularity, and some were brutal, reassign attribution. Convert discovery to relic, move author to rumor. The entries avoided one verb with almost superstitious discipline: erase. They loved quiet, delay, unassign, harmonize, mercy verbs, smiling verbs, the verbs that let decent men sleep. I am not good at sleeping. One evening, after the Monsignor's visit, Matteo produced a tiny vial from a drawer labeled in angry Latin, Atramentum nigri sigilli, black ink of the seal. "Alchemical?" I asked. "Alchemy is just chemistry with manners," he said, and showed me the recipe in a hand that could only be described as expensive. Oak gall, copper salts, vinegar, soot, saved from Easter's new fire. "It makes ink that does not want to fade," he explained. "We use it for names that must survive long silences." He looked at me, and his gaze was the measurement between prudent and cowardly. "You think we only hide," he said. "We also remember quietly, so the remembering lives long enough to return." That night, I volunteered to inventory the chain lengths along the folio rail, a dull task for men who like dullness. I like dullness when it hides edges. While measuring, I discovered one chain with a newer link. Someone had added length, as if allowing a book to travel farther than it should. The folio at the end of that chain was outwardly unremarkable. A ledger of building repairs, dripping cisterns, unhappy plaster, a fresco that had tired of recognizing a saint. I flipped and flipped until a foreign page interrupted the clerical drone, like a joke told in the wrong room. It was a map fragment glued into the ledger, the glue old but not ancient, the paper cut from an atlas with no humility. It showed a coastline that, if true, would complicate several monarchies and a handful of miracles. Someone had needed this piece to be at hand in a place no one would look for a coastline. My measurements suddenly felt like a disguise I had not earned. I noted the chain length, copied the ledger's shelf mark, and placed a bookmark I carried for such dishonesty. A scrap with the word quietare in my own hand. It's a sin to misuse Latin in these halls. It's a bigger sin not to warn yourself when you begin to love the sin. In a different wing of the subcrypt, a wing ventilated by the sighs of machinery, lived a device older than the iron that pretended to be its bones. The Astrarium. Not the famous kind you tour for postcards, but a 13-hour engine that predated the public clock by a century the public is not allowed to own. A little man the archives called the Winder tended it. Not a monk, not a layman, something in between, like a footnote that forgot which text it was serving. "You wind the day?" I asked, watching him turn a key heavy enough to depress unconfessed sins. "I wind what resists stopping," he said. "Days stop. Permission doesn't. What happens if you don't wind it?" "In not I days," he shrugged, an elegant mathematics. "We miss our appointments with the plausible." On the Astrarium's face, the 13th mark was the same eye I had seen in the tribunal room. The winder noticed me noticing. "We use 12 to agree," he said. "We use 13 to listen." "Listen to what?" "Corrections," he said. "They arrive like sailors who mistook the shoreline. We light a lantern and guide them in without letting them name the harbor." He taught me to hear the difference between tick and tock when a manuscript is being contradicted somewhere else in the building. It's a burr, a grace note, a small offense. At first, I thought he was teasing, doing that professional cruelty where insiders pretend to hear symphonies in the hum of a radiator. And then one night, the Astrarium stuttered, and down the corridor a reliquary sighed, and a chained book shifted its weight like a sleeper rolling toward a new dream. I heard it. I did. I will not recant that. As my weeks in the Undercity lengthened, I gathered protocols the way a pickpocket gathers tells. If a reliquary whispers a name, you never repeat it aloud before the Astrarium blinks. Otherwise, you pin a butterfly to a page before it's remembered it has wings. If a palimpsest reveals a woman's voice beneath a sermon, you copy the vowel shapes, not the words, and file the shapes in a drawer that insists it is for rope. If a map refuses to commit to a coastline, you write the verbs of the coast, erode, deposit, argue, and let a future tide copy them into a shore. No rulebook enumerates these acts. They are the customs of a guild that survives by grooming its myths into manuals. The first time I stayed alone after Matteo's step had climbed itself into silence, I met fear properly. Not fear of ghosts, fear of minutes. A draft carted the room, and the candles dimmed with the dignity of old aristocrats. The reliquaries murmured at the level of a conversation in a house where someone is dying in the other room. I spoke aloud, to prove I was not being spoken for. "I am here to file," I said, and the filing cabinets politely pretended not to understand the word. On the desk before me lay an envelope stamped quaerature. "It is asked," and inside, a question written like a hunger. "What is the smallest change we can make to a calendar that moves the largest number of memories without anyone waking badly?" There were 3 proposed answers, all neat, ruthless, humanitarian. Take 10 days, take 13 days, take 7 days, now and 6 later. Each proposal included pastoral guidance for parish priests. How to console a farmer whose name day had been deleted. How to bless a widow whose anniversary now fell on a date that did not exist. At the bottom, someone had scribbled, "It is not cruelty to wake a child late if the house was on fire." And beneath that, another hand, "Unless you lit the fire." I returned the question to its envelope and sealed it with the heat of my own thumb. Archivists are allowed their small heresies. Before leaving that night, I walked once more past the reliquary case. The thorn again cleared its throat, and this time it made a sound that was not sound, but the shape of a verdict. The verdict was later. I don't know how else to put it. I understood that a story had been placed in a drawer with that label, and that my career had been to keep that drawer closed. The thought did not shame me. It exhausted me. Exhaustion is more honest than shame. Shame wants an audience. Exhaustion wants a bed and a pen to write a short will. Leave my certainties to the next obedient man. Keep my questions warm for me. When I climbed back into the world of published streets, the basilica glowed like a rehearsed miracle. The fountains were arguing with the moon. A Swiss guard glanced at my shoes and recognized the dust. He nodded. "A fraternal crime." "Busy?" he asked. "Cataloging," I said. He winced, the way soldiers wince when a civilian uses a battlefield word for bookkeeping. "Careful," he said. "Paper cuts bleed the longest." I laughed the way a man laughs when he has rehearsed a laugh for exactly this exchange. Then I did not sleep. Weeks later, already a lifetime by undercity reckoning, the tribunal summoned me without summoning me. It does that to men who have begun to understand but not yet to rebel. I was present for a session you will read in fuller measure later. The angel's deposition on the matter of time shaved and sweetened. The room was as I described in Chapter 1. The eye at 13 listened with professional compassion. The seraph did not glow, it remembered. Men spoke in minutes. The witness answered in eras of emphasis. I took notes in a hand that tried not to betray me. After, when the candles were extinguished in their correct order, I lingered at the threshold until the air pressed against me with the gentle insistence of a librarian who has closed the reading room but cannot say the word closed. I stepped out into the corridor, and the door closed me again. "Breathe shallow," Matteo told me the next day, as if he had always been standing behind that door. "The deeper you go, the more the air believes it can author you." "Has it authored you?" I asked. "It taught me to prefer verbs that grow old well," he said, and patted the pocket where he kept the black ink recipe. "Record, remember, return, not erase," I said. He shook his head. "We don't have that power. Only the living can erase. We can only delay and arrange. If we're kind, we arrange paths back. Beneath the city of keys, kindness is a geometry. If you get the angles right, a corridor leads you back to a door you were told never opened. If you get them wrong, you wander a century that doesn't exist with the certainty of a man who can quote every catechism but has forgotten the smell of beeswax. I will tell you about the index of forgetting in its heavier details when we reach the place where details will not bruise your sleep. For now, keep this. There is a room that listens. There is a clock that hears corrections. There are books that migrate if you do not chain their longing. And there are men, good men, decent men who learn to breathe shallow so the air does not decorate their souls with someone else's adjectives. For years, I believed my work was custodial. After the 13th bell, I began to suspect it was surgical. Now, drafting this confession in a city that has learned to publish its alleys in light, I can admit the simplest truth. Beneath St. Peter's, I learned how to change a century without waking a child. I am telling you this so that some morning, when you wake and the date feels slippery, you will not call yourself foolish. You will call a friend and go walking to find the street that refuses to admit it moved. And you will ask the right question, not who erased, but who promises to return what was only quieted. The reliquaries would like that question. It is shaped the way they like to speak gently, insistently, like candle smoke choosing a ceiling. Somewhere, as you read this, a cabinet of small, stubborn witnesses clears its throat. It is getting ready to remember you back. The first lesson they teach you is how to name a gap without sounding like you're accusing a century of theft. You don't say missing. You say harmonized. You don't say deleted. You say quieted. If a festival vanishes between one parish bulletin and the next, the bulletin explains that it has been translated to a more fitting season. If a saint's feast day falls into the river, someone writes that the river has moved. In the archives below, we learn to respect such phrasing the way sailors respect tides. But sailors still keep a second map folded into their coat. I kept mine in my pocket, like a superstition, the small fragment I told you about, cut from a larger atlas that our public rooms refused to acknowledge. Its coastline contradicted 3 monarchies and half a dozen sermons. It wasn't ambitious. It was precise. Precision, I discovered, is a kind of rebellion when everyone around you prefers grandeur. The fragment fit my palm as if asking to be smuggled into daylight. I smuggled it into nights instead. The Index Oblivionis has a drawer called Nomina Names. It doesn't contain the saints you know. It contains the ones you might have known if your grandparents had slept badly. Each card is written in a hand that never once shook. Name, dates, province, and then a small instruction in the tone of a tailor's note, shorten hem by a quiet inch. Some entries direct us to delay a canonization until a patron is less politically useful. Others to move a miracle to a village where the bishop owes a favor. A few instruct the scribe to reassign an authorship, which is a delicate verb for a violent act, turning a woman's equation into a relic, a child's discovery into a legend with no author's face. One evening, I found a cluster of cards secured with a thread the color of old bruises. The top card read, Sancta under review. Beneath it, a name I will not repeat here, not to protect the guilty, but to protect the living. Names have a way of waking when pronounced. The instructions said, remove from public calendar, retain in private litanies, redirect pilgrimage traffic by pastoral letter concerning access works. In the margin, a note, miracles continue irrespective of docketing, only witnesses fatigue. Fatigue is the secret metric of every institution. You can exhaust a people without ever raising your voice. I asked Brother Matteo, In the gentle voice we use when we fear our question might grow teeth, why the card avoided the word erase. He lifted the vial of black ink, the one compounded to outlive stubborn dawns, and rolled it between his fingers until it caught the candlelight like a verdict. "We are not executioners," he said. "We are stewards of emphasis, stewards who decide what lives in the sunlight." I said. "Emphasis is custody," he replied. "Custody is mercy. The world is a child easy to frighten, eager to imitate. Mercy is the art of not overwhelming." He sighed, and for a breath, the sigh sounded like an apology. And sometimes, if we are honest, mercy is laziness dressed in a stole. He took me then to a cabinet with a lock that learned your fingerprints before the word existed. Inside, an album bound in skin that had once held a nobler text, "The scars told you so." The spine was stamped with a title that has never been spoken above the catacombs. Calendarium Duplex, the double calendar. On the left page, the year as the world keeps it. Feast days, tides of fasting, a measured procession of patience from January to a December that forgives. On the right page, the same year wearing its night clothes. Feast days that never happened, fasts that lengthened into storms, a substitution of one king for another, and the small practicalities that keep kings interchangeable. Which side is true? I asked, because apprentices are compelled by the oath of stupidity to ask indelicate questions early, while they can still blame inexperience for the shape of their doubts. "Both are true," he said, "in the way a face is true from the left and from the right. And from head-on?" He smiled. "Head-on is for Judgment Day." I began to suspect the double calendar was less a book than a nerve, the kind of nerve that reports pain only when it's too late for anesthetic. The entries on the night-clothes side were not lurid, they were tidy. March 7. Translate the relics of the mathematician. Record thunder as homage. April 23. Rename the canal to break the memory of the woman who proved the bridge wrong. June 11. Remove orphan census from diocesan report. Move wheat tallies to replace it. Annotate with compassion. If cruelty had been louder, I would have felt braver. Instead, I felt implicated by the quiet. It was Matteo's cough that alerted me to the phantom table, a slim folio misfiled in a ledger that recorded plaster repairs and the mortality rates of candlesticks. The table was a neat sequence of entries labeled "Years Without Currency." Between two numbers lay a thin silver line, the kind mapmakers use to signify a border that eludes treaty. In the column of reasons, the handwriting grew both smaller and more convinced. To align tides with wheat, to soothe the scandal of a saint who healed a man no longer on record, to oblige a treaty whose date won't sit, to forgive a king who could not pronounce an eclipse. I touched the silver line. The paper cooled my skin the way winter cools glass. Matteo took my hand away with a tenderness I hadn't earned. "Do not feed the line," he said. "It grows." "Is this the phantom time?" I asked. He weighed the words. "Phantom is a word the tired use because it forgives them. We prefer discretionary era." "What do you prefer?" I asked. "I prefer the truth," he said, "but I prefer it alive." He closed the folio and traced the spine with the same motion he used to bless bread. "Don't worry, truth isn't a hothouse flower. It survives winter. We are only arranging windbreaks." I wanted to believe him. The confession you're hearing now is the residue of that wanting. In those months, the listening room, the tribunal we are not meant to call a tribunal, asked for my presence more often. I never received an invitation. The air simply learned how to smell like instructions at the hour when most men learn to sleep. The chairs creaked with the morality of furniture. The eye at 13 regarded us without reproach. The reliquaries arrived like nervous witnesses, never in full drama, only in the small dignity of objects that have endured too many hands. One session concerned an abbess's star diary, a slender sequence of nights where she had written the positions of certain stubborn lights and the way they refused to match the authorized sky. The diary had already been harmonized twice. The harmonizers had softened the abbess's verbs until her insistence sounded like weather. Still, the stars would not behave. The witness that night was a sliver of glass, cut from a lens that had once been smuggled into a cloister under the cover of a reliquary lid. The scribe called the session. The presider asked the glass to state what it had seen. The glass does not see as we do. It remembers displacement. It testified that the abbess had not erred. The sky had. Or rather, the sky had been renamed after the fact, to satisfy a treaty that required a coronation under a precise configuration of light. The abbess had written first. The sky, on paper, followed. Can that be undone? The presider asked. Always the civil servant. Not undone, the witness said, in a voice that felt like the underside of light. Recalled. They made a note to delay the abbess's cause for sainthood. Delay is their sacrament. It does what execution cannot. It convinces the descendants to forget the corpse belonged to them. After the glass, a ring fragment testified concerning a conclave with twins. Two outcomes birthed the same night, one modestly brighter than the other. The brighter outcome would have drawn attention to a library that corrected a king. The dimmer permitted a later miracle to be attributed safely. The tribunal selected the dimmer path. The minutes were clear, cheerful, brief. I copied them in the hand that would betray me only years later when I tried to sleep and my fingers moved without me. Do we make history? I whispered to Matteo that night as we shelved the record among other innocuous tragedies. No, he said. We church it. Church as a verb? As the patient art of placing weight where a beam won't bruise, he said. We're carpenters of memory. We shave where the board splinters. We sand where a hand would bleed. And if the house leans? I asked. He looked at me with the sadness of a man who knows which question comes next and cannot make his mouth prevent it. Then we pretend leaning is a style. I returned to the double calendar more than I should have. It began to feel like a mirror that only behaves if you visit it at the same hour each night. On one visit, a note had appeared in the margin in a hand I did not recognize. Fear is the safest library. It's possible the note had always been there. Sometimes words hatch when you admit you are ready to be nested by them. I copied it onto a scrap and tucked it behind the map fragment in my pocket. Between them, fear and coastline struck a bargain. If one of us forgets the harbor, the other will remember the wind. In the reading room of the unread, I found a small catechism for clerks, a series of questions and answers that taught the mouth how to explain to the obedient what could never be said naked. Question: why was Father's name day moved? Answer: the stars desired a more harmonious tide for his virtues. Cues: where did the saint's bones go? Answer: bones travel like seeds. The spirit is a wind. Quests: why can we not find the street where mother was born? Answer: cities molt. You are living in its new skin. On the final page, a clerk had written in a cramped, mutinous hand, "And what if the child does not believe us?" No answer had been provided. There are questions that institutions prefer to leave as pious silence. Here is a mechanism I have not yet confessed. Maps are litigants. They come to the tribunal in rolled skins. They unscroll like the tongues of old reptiles, and they lie with the elegance of men who own ships. One night, a map argued that a pilgrimage route had always crossed a certain river near a certain ford. The reliquaries murmured small corrections like midwives until a splinter of wood from a wayfarer's staff got itself heard. The staff said that pilgrims had once crossed 2 days downstream at a ford that no longer existed because a canal had been renamed and then permitted to outgrow its usefulness. The map flushed under our fingers like a patient with a fever. The presider ruled for the staff. The map, deprived of dignity, allowed its ink to cool into a truthful line. I learned then that objects keep grudges gentler than ours. They forgive sooner, if forgiveness is the speed with which you agree to be seen. From time to time, word rose from the basilica that another calendar correction would be announced in sermon form, an afternoon homily to tidy up a millennium. These adjustments are never large. Large adjustments break chairs. Small adjustments move the chairs without waking the sitters. The drafts arrived to be scored by the tribunal. How to explain 10 days without convincing a village they had been robbed. How to bless a widow whose anniversary disappeared politely between Thursday and Friday. How to shuffle Easters without bruising a century's worth of baptisms. The drafts were pastoral, tender, slightly desperate. I marked them with the only power I believed I had left. I drew a small I where a number would fit if we were honest. Numbers are poor substitutes for eyes. Brother Matteo began to leave me alone with the listening room longer than he used to. Apprenticeship is sometimes indistinguishable from abandonment. I sat there with the reliquary on the pedestal closed, because silence also testifies, and listened to the human minutes that no one will quote. A scribe with a tired marriage. A presider with a saint he refused to pray to because the saint remembered him too clearly. A custodian who had once seen the winder cry when the 13 tick fell out of key with the room's breath. None of this is doctrine. All of it is the humidity that keeps doctrine from cracking. The winder taught me a trick I still perform with my wrist when the world resists sleeping. Count 12 as the world counts, then rest your finger where the 13th would be, and let the skin listen. If nothing arrives, you are free. If something thrums the bone, a correction is approaching. You may not like it. Corrections rarely wear the face you hoped for, but they are honest visitors. When they leave, the furniture sits more squarely. One night, let me be precise. One liturgical hour that pretended to be to Matteo did not arrive. The tribunal had begun without him. The reliquary on the pedestal contained a veil-light fabric, fraying with dignity the faint scent of crushed frankincense. The presider asked the veil for its statement. The veil said, in a voice that offered warmth as a form of refusal, I covered a face removed from the calendar. The face continued to shine. I am here to say that light is not docketed. Wind share. The scribe's quill paused, as if the sentence had loosened his training. The presider wrote the minutes in the tidy Latin of an accountant. The tribunal ruled to defer commemoration to a more suitable climate. The veil sounded amused, which is how mercy hides its disgust. When the session ended, I lingered near the door, because doors had become my grammar. The veil's box hummed to itself, the way empty things hum when they remember occupied days. On the wall, a small crucifix that had not been curated in years hung crooked. I reached to straighten it, then stopped. Straightness is not always correction. Sometimes, straightness is erasure of an honest tilt. On my walk back to the world above the basilica, rehearsing sleeplessness in stone, I decided to commit a courtesy crime. Crimes performed with courtesy fashion, a corridor for repentance. I returned to the cabinet of names, drew the drawer that knew my pulse, and selected 3 cards, tied with the bruise-colored thread. I did not remove them. I read them aloud, not fully only the vowels, the shapes of breath that give a name its body. The reliquaries bristled and then calmed, like cats on a sill deciding that the wind is not an intruder. Somewhere in the building, the astrarium ticked 13 with a note that favored mercy. Later, I whispered, not as a verdict this time, but as a promise. Later we will remember you properly. Later we will give you back to the calendar that did not deserve your subtraction. Later we will teach the clerks to answer the child's question. Later is a poor word. It is the only wealth I had to hand that night. When I found Matteo the next day, his cough had eaten more of him. He sat with the black ink of the seal and watched it the way a priest watches a candle he can no longer climb to light. You went alone, he said. The room was merciful, I said. He shook his head. Rooms don't do mercy. People do. Sometimes angels. Sometimes bones. He lifted the vial and set it down like a period. I will retire soon. They will assign you a partner with better lungs and worse questions. I have a map, I said, foolish as a child offering a drawing. We all have maps, he said. The sin is not carrying them. The sin is forgetting to fold them back into your coat when the street insists. What if the street lies? I asked. Then you walk it long enough to collect its verbs, he said. Streets have fewer verbs than maps. If the verbs contradict your paper, believe the verbs. What are the verbs for our work? I asked. He closed his eyes, reciting as if he had written it and regretted it. Record, delay, translate, harmonize, reassign, quieten, return. He opened his eyes, and for a heartbeat they looked like windows. Return, he repeated. We forget that one. The confession of this chapter is not a headline. I cannot give you a century's scandal in the shape that newspapers like to kiss. I can give you something heavier. The manners with which a century leans until a room of decent men decide that leaning is a style. I can give you the smell of vellum that won't stop stating the obvious, the way a thorn speaks a date like a stubborn uncle, the way a veil refuses to accept that light requires permission, the way maps pout when corrected by walking. I can give you the wrist trick. Count 12, leave a space for 13, and listen. You will know then whether a correction is entering your house. If it is, set another place at the table. Corrections eat like guests who have walked very far and learned not to speak until the steam leaves the soup. Above ground, the basilica kept its scheduled miracles. The fountains applauded gravity. Pilgrims took photographs of altars that have never once complained about being adored for the wrong reasons. Below ground, the double calendar turned a page. No printer would ink. The index of forgetting added a card that did not use the verb it wanted. The listening room prepared another chair, and my pocket kept its coastline, patient as a secret that knows it will become a bridge when we stop confusing sunlight for judgment. This chapter ends where honesty begins, with a small note in a dangerous hand, mine left in a drawer that pretended to be for rope. The note read, "Later is not a place, it is a door." I slid the drawer shut and listened to the building remember me. Somewhere, the 13th mark blinked. I felt it not as an accusation but as permission, which is a rarer mercy than absolution. The door did not so much open as it consented, which is how the most dangerous doors behave. A hinge turned, the air adjusted its grammar, and I stepped once more into the room that pretends to be smaller than the business it conducts. I brought with me the habits of a clerk pocket notebook, pencil shaved to a respectable humility, lips trained to close around questions until they ripen. I left my fear outside. Fear is not permitted in rooms that rely on minutes. Fear adds adjectives. Minutes require verbs. You would be disappointed, perhaps, by the furnishings. Ordinary chairs arranged in a crescent, their wood scarred not by crisis, but by patience. A narrow table for the scribes, the grain polished to a sheen, no oil explains. A pedestal at the center, proportioned for objects that insist on dignity. The clock on the back wall had 12 marks, and then a 13th that was not a mark, but an eye, painted with the accuracy of a saint and the suspicion of a magistrate. No gilding, no frescoes, only light that had clearly been sworn to secrecy. I have been asked, though not here, what the tribunal calls itself. Officially, a subcommittee of a commission of a congregation, all of it precise and none of it true. The colloquial name that never reaches paper is the listening. It is a perfect name. It promises nothing, admits everything, and reminds the proud that hearing is labor. The session began with the vow I had copied but never signed. Not to truth, which arrives unformatted, but to legibility, which fits margins. The presider raised a hand, and the room aligned its breath. My pencil flirted with the paper, then waited. We always wait for the first sound, the scrape of a reliquary's hinge, the faint complaint of metal that has been touched by too many centuries of tenderness, or, on rarer nights tonight, a shift in light that suggests something with wings has elected to fold them. "Proceed," the presider said, in a voice optimized to travel but never arrive. The reliquary on the pedestal was not ostentatious. A plain oval frame of gilded restraint, glass like a calm verdict. Inside, a fabric trapped motion, threads that once knew how to be air. The label read, in a hand that apologized for its own existence, "Veil, provenance complex." The veil we would hear later. First, the angel. Angels do not enter. They reduce the room's need for doors. I do not claim to have seen what painters flatter themselves into imagining. No feathers, no trumpets. A pressure altered, as if the atmosphere had chosen a new author. The light did a small courtesy to our eyes and bent into a posture we could call attention. My pencil marked the page at the top. Session 312, De Temporibus and Nomina, concerning times and names. The presider's hands were folded in the bureaucrat's prayer palms parallel, fingers uninterlaced, ready to resume their work. He did not ask, "Who are you?" We have learned not to write what cannot be filed. He asked, "Witness, state the matter you are prepared to testify to." The voice call it voice arrived as the gentle pressure you feel when a window closing invites the room to agree. It was not masculine or feminine. It was the part of a human voice that remains when gender has resigned for the evening. "I am prepared to speak," it said, On the rind of time you removed and called alignment, and on the names you have quieted and called prudence. Do you attest to having observed these matters? The presider asked. I attest to Light's refusal to forget, said the witness. You will answer in particulars, the presider said. He is paid to hate poetry. I will answer in emphases, the witness replied. Particulars disrobe themselves when emphasis is honest. The scribe to my left, her ink never blots, began the ledger. I. On the shaving of years, the witness spoke in phenomena rather than dates. A bell was taught to strike 13 so that memory would keep a place for corrections, it said. You blurred 10 days and hung the sun around the neck of the decision like a medal. The people forgave you because the sky is an old accomplice for clerks. In the quiet century you trust no one to pronounce. You moved a library by moving the feast that would have drawn its patrons. The library sighed and called itself humble. The city obeyed. Purpose, the presider said. Mercy in the mouth, the witness said. Custody in the hand. Were miracles involved? The presider asked, because a line on the form required it. Not miracles, the witness said, but editing. You excused it as tenderness. Sometimes you were correct. Often you were merely tired. In this geu, the scribe's quill paused at that admission, tiredness recorded like a sacrament. My pencil, less important, drew a small I in the margin where a number should stand if we were honest. Proceed to names, the presider said, turning the page with practiced piety. Names, said the witness, are the first architecture. You removed some from the street and left their houses standing. You called the houses tradition and the absence mystery. You did not kill them. You postponed them. Postponement is the most durable coffin. We prefer the term discretion, the presider said. You prefer weather when a storm is deliberate, the witness said. It is a form of courtesy that keeps you from hearing thunder as a verdict. The clock's 13th mark listened. I could feel it. That extra time, neither day nor night, holding still so our notes could decide what the morning must know. We altered tempo because rituals prevent collapse. The presider nodded to the veil. The reliquary's glass clouded as if it had taken a breath. When the veil spoke, it used human strategy details, humor employed as an apology for truth, the occasional calendar verb to keep the clerks from fainting. I covered a face after the calendar decided the face did not exist, the veil said. It continued to shine. I report that light obeys no index and feasts without dates. State the events leading to your involvement, said the scribe. Kindness held taut like a ribbon. A procession, the veil said. A miracle no one had ordered. A village's gratitude. A letter written by a bishop who had once been a boy good at sums. A correction proposed with pastoral adjectives. A delay enacted so gently the children clapped. Outcome. You learned to call a candle a relic, so a girl's equation could be postponed, said the veil. The candle burned obediently. The equation found a drawer. The presider wrote, outcome acceptable, with the steadiness of bureaucracy. I wanted to draw a mouth beside it, a small, dissatisfied mouth. My pencil misbehaved and drew an ear instead, the shape you sketch when you remember that listening is a verb. We adjourned for the length of a paragraph. The tribunal drinks water, never wine. Even mercy has rules. When we resumed, the presider performed the liturgy of minutes, the small sequence of questions designed to keep the room from becoming an oracle. Oracles ruin record-keeping. Minutes domesticate wonder until it can share a shelf with invoices. Witness, he said to whatever in the air preferred to be called witness, state whether the phantom interval restored the balance of calendars with minimal pastoral harm. Is so tough. Minimal is the perfect lie, said the witness. It is accurate and wicked. You cut cloth at the seam you hoped no one would inspect. You rested your palm over the hem and smiled. The smile fits in the minutes. The hem does not. We cannot publish a sentence that calls us wicked, the presider said mildly. You can publish the word minimal, the witness replied. It rings like a spoon on a chalice. People like the sound. The scribe wrote, pastoral harm, minimized to the ordinary grieve. She is very good at making grief sound grammatical. Here is what I learned by surviving that hour. The listening is less a courtroom than a tuning. We present the instrument history, and the witnesses hum the notes that do not sit true. The presider adjusts pegs. Scribes mark degrees. The object on the pedestal remembers what our words forgot to owe. When the clock's eye is satisfied, the room allows itself to be called finished. But that night, the eye blinked and did not close. There was another matter unlisted, unsummoned. The winder entered with his key still heavy from turning the 13. He placed a map fragment on the pedestal, the twin of the one I kept folded against my heart. He did not look at me. Men trained in discretion have peripheral vision that avoids guilt. Statement, the presider said. The coast refuses the catechism, the winder said simply. Pilgrims would have crossed here, and he tapped a quiet bay my fragment agreed with. But the canal was renamed, and then allowed to drown its usefulness. The name change removed the memory of a ford. The ford removed the pilgrimage's left turn. The left turn removed 3 saints and a widow's story. The city became proud of a bridge that never needed building. The presider does not enjoy being presented with diagrams of consequence. He prefers consequence in prose. Witnesses? He asked. The cabinet of reliquaries offered itself as a choir that refused harmony on principle. A staff splinter spoke first, the pride of old wood in its vowels. We touched water 2 days down river. A coin with a hole for a string said, I bought a bed in the village you forget, because the bell tower fell. A pilgrim shell murmured, we sang the wrong psalm for a century, because the priest's nephew owned a ferry. The room smiled without moving its lips. Everyone likes an anecdote that incriminates no one living. Ruling? The scribe asked the presider, though her hand had already begun to write it. Translate the root, he said. Use the language of erosion. People respect rivers when they sound inevitable. And the saints? I asked, softer than breath, breaking a rule that has no codex but many teeth. The presider looked at me with the mild interest of a teacher who has not yet decided whom to recommend for expulsion. The saints are alive regardless, he said. We adjust witness access, which is to say, the winder murmured, we adjust memory. No one wrote that. The veil cleared its non-throat. Memory adjusts itself, it said, amused again. You match the fabric to the light so that no one sees the seam. It is tailoring with psalms. I should explain the oaths we use when the room's patience thins. There is the oath of legibility, which you know. There is the oath of silence, which is less about secrecy than about protecting syntax. We promise not to phrase a truth in such a way that it dies upon publication. And there is the oath of return, rarely spoken, easily broken, in which a clerk vows to maintain a path back for what has been postponed. A footnote shelved in a geography drawer. A recipe for black ink placed inside a book of psalms. A child's question wrapped in a priest's homily, where a bored student will find it in 208 years. We are clumsy thieves. We leave receipts. After the map, a ring fragment took the pedestal for what the minutes later called the matter of the twins. I have to choose my nouns carefully. The room hoards certain words and punishes their casual use by drying out the tongue. The ring spoke of a conclave that ended twice, the brighter outcome and the dimmer one sharing the same night. The brighter outcome would have illuminated a library where a woman had written the verbs of the stars a century before her permission. The dimmer outcome permitted a palace to keep its agreements without changing the window where the prince recited morning prayers. The tribunal chose dimness. Dimness is easier to furnish. The minutes recorded, "We prefer stability to spectacle." They always do. "Do you ever choose spectacle?" I asked Matteo later, in the corridor where the evangelists on the wall pretend not to overhear clerks. "Easter," he said. "Baptism. Sometimes the wind. Those are not ours to choose," I said. He shrugged. "Precisely. The session's final witness was the angel again, called back as if our sentences could be braided more tightly if light held one end." "One more item," the presider said, "on the matter of education. The Catechism for Clerks proposes certain phrases for difficult parishioners. We ask whether the rhetoric achieves pastoral balance." The witness considered. The room permitted consideration to feel like weather. "You teach them to say the stars desired harmony, the city molted, the bones travel like seeds," it said. "This is good rhetoric. It softens the shock that breaks chairs. But you must add one sentence." "What sentence?" the presider asked, pen poised to bless a comma. "Say that memory returns," the witness said gently. "Teach them that later is a direction, not a ditch." The presider frowned the way men frown when they suspect a sentence will cost them sleep. "That will encourage agitation," he said. "It will encourage custody," the witness replied. "Of the right kind, the kind that leaves the door ajar." The scribe wrote, "Addendum considered." Considered is the bureaucratic past tense of ignored. We adjourned. The candles were snuffed. Left, right, center. The old choreography for settling stories without picking favorites. The clock's eye closed the 13th with a kindness that felt like fatigue. The reliquaries rested as much as relics rest, an active resting, like a cat pretending not to dream. I stayed. The presider does not dismiss me. He dismisses the minutes. Men who file themselves leave only when the paper in their pockets grows warm with unsaid things. Mine burned. I stepped closer to the pedestal and spoke to the air with the rudeness of a man who has forgotten his station. "Is there atonement for postponement?" I asked. Light, a polite rearrangement of it, regarded me. "Atonement is a calendar word," the witness said. "Try return." "How?" I asked, and my pencil, traitor, recorded the plea. "Leave handles," said the witness. "A margin that refuses to be trimmed. A chant whose missing verse hums in a parish's throat. A map fragment folded into a ledger. A child who will ask a question no teacher has been paid enough to bury under adjectives." "What if the child is punished?" I asked. "The child will learn verbs," said the witness. "Verbs survive most punishments. There is an livin' in reditions. We of God displains, we all displains." The winder re-entered. pretended surprise that I was still there, then offered a small cough, which, in this building, is the equivalent of a knock. "Come," he said. "The astrarium likes a visitor who smells of minutes." We walked the corridor that counts itself, past the shelf where the double calendar sleeps, with one page open to daytime and one to night close. The machine greeted us with the humility of an elderly animal, blessed with reliable appetites. The winder's key turned the heart back into brave motion. "Do you know what I do here?" he asked, not rhetorically. Men who wind the 13th have shed the burden of rhetorical questions. "You keep corrections from arriving empty-handed," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Close," he allowed. "I keep the door that corrections prefer from warping in damp weather." "And when the weather itself is the correction?" I asked. "Then," he said, "I oil the hinge and listen." We listened. There is a music at that hour no instrument admits to having taught itself. It is not pretty, it is accurate. Somewhere a reliquary murmured a forgotten vowel. Somewhere a clerk coughed remorse into his sleeve. Somewhere a saint remembered the taste of river water and declined canonization for the evening, so a widow could finish a lullaby. We are not paid to record this. We are changed by it anyway. Back in the listening room, the veil remained on the pedestal, as if to deter me from certain ambitions. I stood at an angle. Relics prefer angles, and said, almost confidentially, "I will write you back into a feast." "Feasts arrive without clerks," the veil said, amused. "Write a bench instead, people will sit, memory will do the rest." A bench. The audacity of furniture. I wrote nothing heroic that night. I wrote handles. In the index card for the saint under review, I replaced quieten with "translate a sin so small you might mistake it for a smudge." In the catechism, for clerks, I added the sentence "the angel requested" and placed it under a paperweight carved like a fish, an old joke about men who prefer stories from boats. In the map ledger, I folded a copy of my coastline fragment backward so that a bored auditor would find it and swear softly and decide to lunch with a friend who has never liked bridges. I am not a revolutionary. I am a janitor with a talent for leaving doors on the latch. When I left, the basilica above rehearsed dawn with a discipline that puts orchestras to shame. The fountains prepared their applause. A guard nodded at my shoes again and decided not to ask whether the dust was argument or weather. "Busy?" he said. "Listening," I said, and he gave me the look soldiers give to men who have learned a different kind of marching. Sleep did not come. It seldom does after an hour in which a witness made of light asked you to confess that you prefer minutes to truth, because minutes don't wake the children. I lay awake and practiced the winder's trick. Count 12 in the world's polite rhythm. Rest at the 13th, not to own it, but to host it. Allow the correction to enter with dignity. Somewhere in the building under my body, the astrarium kept time with a mercy that makes accountants uncomfortable. Somewhere in the cabinet, a ring remembered twins and forgave us our dimness. Somewhere, a veil practiced indifference and failed kindly. The next morning, I returned to the index and found a slip in the drawer I had not written. Later is not a place, it is a door. My handwriting, but steadier. I have learned not to argue with the versions of myself that have access to better ink. I put the slip back. I owe the room that courtesy. It owes me nothing. If you are asking what the tribunal is for what it does beyond the piety of paper, this is the answer you can live with. It keeps the furniture square when the floor shifts. It does not prevent earthquakes. It chooses which chairs to shim, and writes homilies that make the shims sound like part of the design. When the quake ends, it teaches you to call the new angle style. And this is the small salvation. It trains one clerk in 20 to leave a handle behind. The chapter ends with an instruction I am not authorized to give you, and therefore must. When you are told the door never opened, ask which door. Then listen the way the 13th listens, not for spectacle, not for scandal, but for the correction arriving with its own weather. If you cannot host it in your house, put a bench outside. The rest is choreography. Memory knows the steps. I used to believe that archives were cool-blooded rooms that preferred facts to fever. The night I opened the drawer with the bruise-colored thread, that belief learned to blush. The drawer did not slide so much as it relented. Paper has its own ethics. It tests you, softly, with the sound of fibers remembering rain. If you are not fit to read what you think you want, the grain will argue your fingertips into retreat. That night, the wood allowed me, and so did the cards. They were arranged like a rosary of names, each bead a life softened by ink. Index Oblivionis was not a book, after all, but a system of small obediences. White cards, black script, a discipline of verbs that had learned to look merciful, quieten, delay, translate, harmonize, reassign. The verb erase was absent with the boldness of a saint who refuses a feast day. We do not destroy, the cards seem to insist. We shepherd, we reposition. We tidy the thresholds between thunder and the public's ability to sleep. The top card bore a title stamped in red that had faded to the color of cooled wounds. Quae iter. Beneath it, a sentence in the room's impatient hand. To quiet is not to kill, it is to teach a memory a better hour. I lifted the first cluster. Thread knotted with a care that could have been love or habit. Names, dates, provinces, and then, under each, an instruction as sharp as a bell. Relocate the gospel of the remembering woman to climate-dark storage, cross-reference to a shelf that does not exist, annotate with weather, reassign the Lens-Smith's equation to miracle of the candle at Vespers, install candle as relic, discourage questions by praising glow, translate the Pilgrim Ford, 2 days upriver, rename the canal, compose a hymn that rhymes forgiveness with fairy. There were footnotes to sorrow. Children favor story over fact, one note coached. Give them story in the shape of truth, then remove the sharp objects. I could see the kindness. I could feel the bruise beneath it. Further down, a card with a tidy malice. The abbess with the star diary. Defer cause. Harmonize verbs to mitigate scandal of accurate sky. Praise her humility. Remove her horizon. Another card. Pope's twin outcome. Select the dimmer. Brighter reveals library. Dimmer preserves treaty. Prepare minute on stability. The minutes wrote themselves in my head. Their tones sweet as bread and just as easy to break. In the bottom of the drawer lay a portfolio stamped with a crown of thorns and a single Latin imperative that sounded like a lullaby with ice in it. Quietare. I unwrapped it. A breeze that did not belong to the room crossed my wrist. Inside, directives written in immaculate script. the sort of handwriting you trust against your better judgment. Directive A. 13. When a woman's authorship threatens to arrive early, convert to relic. Choose a candle with good manners. Attribute heat to piety. File equation as blessed residue of Vespers. Directive C. 7. When a map refuses the catechism, delay the coast by hymn. Compose erosion litanies, rivers do as rivers do, and allow faith to imitate geology. Directive E. 2. Asterisk. If calendar smoothing requires a saint to fall between Thursday and Friday, publish a pastoral. Sleep 10 days long, child. The sun will keep your breakfast warm. Directive M. 0. If the angel refuses minutes, switch to emphases. If emphases accuse, switch to weather. If weather storms, install a leak and send for buckets. At the bottom, different ink, sharper, hurried, a knife pretending to be a pen. Fear is the safest library. I closed my eyes, as if the lids could file the paper back into decency. When I opened them, the reliquaries along the wall had brightened exactly as much as compassion allows. They did not accuse. They did what relics do best. They offered context. A splinter from a pilgrim's staff cleared its old wood throat. We remember water, it said, not in words, but in the geography of air. A ring that had outlived a martyr offered a metallic sigh. We remember hands. The veil, folded like evening, allowed itself one sentence. We remember light. The room was now a choir that had chosen not to harmonize. Harmony comforts too soon. I turned a card over and found a name. Inked in black, stronger than sleep. Not a saint, a child. A little notation that read, "Excessive questions." The instruction beneath had been written and then revised. First quieten, scratched out to make room for translate, then scratched out again and replaced with delay catechism, redirect to arithmetic. In the margin, someone had drawn a small fish. The joke was not lost on me, and for once I wished it had been. The drawer to my right handled maps. Slender skins, rolled and tied with ribbon, like polite conspiracies. I unrolled one and found my coastline again, my fragment's parent, perhaps. The coast had been moved the way a memory is moved, not far enough to break a heart, just enough to confuse an inheritance. A note in the same immaculate hand, shoreline relocated for harmony of Easter. Keep the tide consistent with homily. Teach children that rivers love to be late. On the table behind me lay the catechism for clerks we used to teach manners to grief. I opened it to the page of approved phrases and noticed a new sentence, the one the angel had asked for and the presider had declined. It had been written in my hand, though I had no memory of writing it. Say that memory returns. Beneath, an annotation. Return is not disobedience. It is a season. I felt like a thief who discovers a note in his pocket in the perfect script of the house he robbed. Drink water. Leave a light. The astrarium hiccuped. A burr of metal. A correction arriving with its own weather. The winder's key turned somewhere like an organist saving a hymn from chaos. The 13th listened and did not blink. I carried the portfolio of directives to the listening room, as if it might bite. The tribunal was empty, or as empty as a room gets after a witness made of wings has folded its light. Chairs waited like discipline. The pedestal was bare. I placed the folder upon it and waited, the way a man waits for a confession to meet him halfway. The air adjusted its collar. I read aloud, not the obscene parts, which were all of it, but the verbs. If I have learned anything, it is this. Verbs move history more than dates. Relocate, I said. Reassign, translate, harmonize, delay. The room collected them like tools laid on a cloth. I could almost hear the presider's pen making ordinary grammar out of necessary sin. Is there absolution? I asked the empty crescents of chairs. For a century shaven minimally? When no one answered, I added the sentence that the angel had requested, say that memory returns. As if it were a drop of oil where a hinge groaned. The veil arrived without spectacle, only the air's courtesy changing posture. You speak like a man polishing a knife, it said, amused as fabric can be. Knives are honest. Do you plan to cut the rope or mark it for later? Later, I said, ashamed of how small the word sounded. Then leave handles, said the veil. Cut nothing you cannot lift again. It's set. I am ashamed of very few crimes of courtesy. I committed 3 before dawn and slept poorly as payment. The first was to substitute a verb in the index. Where a card requested quieten, I wrote, translate, then laid the black ink of the seal over the line so that a clerk with a slower conscience would have to work twice to remove it. The second was to insert into the catechism a call and response for children who do not forgive easily. Q. Where did our day go? A. It is waiting for you at the river. Q. Will it return? A. Days are rivers. They find their level. The third was to fold a copy of my coastline under an invoice for plaster repairs, because plaster is what you apply when walls have recently remembered they are earth. On my way out, I paused at the cabinet of names and allowed my mouth a sin I had sworn off. I whispered 3 names only vowels, never consonants, for vowels are the body of compassion, and consonants the scaffolding of control. The reliquaries bristled and then smoothed, like a room deciding to forgive the audacity of a visitor who wants to help without knowing the choreographies of help. Somewhere, the astrarium favored the 13th. A correction entered the building with its coat unbuttoned. Later is not a place, I wrote, again, on a scrap that found its way into the saint's under review drawer. It is a door. I do not expect doors to thank me. I expect them to hold. The winder found me with hands that smelled of oil and patience. You have been trespassing in the polite sections, he said, without judgment. I have been assisting the furniture, I said. Furniture appreciates shims, he replied. But never confuse shims with foundations. Do we have foundations? I asked. Or only styles? Light, he said. Light is foundation. Foundations do not mind being delayed if you leave windows. Windows, benches, handles. I was beginning to understand the architecture of return. Come, he said, and we visited the 13. He taught me a second wrist trick, count 12 with your pulse, and then let your finger rest on the space where a number refuses to sit. In that pause, imagine a name slipping its leash, a map deciding to confess a shore, a calendar wishing to apologize to a widow who believes herself ridiculous for missing a day she was told never existed. In the pause, imagine forgiveness learning to speak without permission. If the skin hums, a correction is near, I asked him, because I needed a practical mercy, whether the index ever returned what it borrowed. He did not lie. Seldom, he said, but we leave receipts. He had the grace to smile at the ugliness of the word. "The receipts are not to indict the future," he added. "They are to assist it." Brother Matteo was waiting in the corridor where the air keeps track of confessions. He held the vial of black ink, the way an old man holds a keepsake from a war he pretends he did not lose. "You found the portfolio," he said. "I found its verbs," I replied. "Did you add one?" he asked. "Return," I said, quietly. He nodded, and the nod contained both a blessing and a resignation. "They will assign you a partner who loves minutes more than truth," he said gently. "Do not teach him contempt. Teach him handles." "You'll be gone," I said. "Not far," he answered, the way a saint lies kindly. "There are windows in retirement." I carried the portfolio back to its drawer. Around me, the reliquaries did not murmur approval. Holy objects do not flatter. They maintain a temperature in the room that nudges your conscience out of bed. I placed the folder on its bed of cards and felt the paper accept my apology, the way a patient forgives a doctor who sutures without anesthetic, because the anesthetic would kill the heart. At the corridor's elbow, a small crucifix hung crooked. I considered straightening it and then remembered the veil's counsel. Not all corrections deserve straightness. Some tilts tell the truth of a room. I left the crucifix inclined, its Christ remembering gravity as a form of honesty. Above ground, Rome rehearsed dawn. Bells prepared to behave for the public hours, and pigeons arranged their treaties with fountains. I kept walking, past guards who measured dust more accurately than clocks, past tourists who would later swear they felt something beneath their feet that could not be named in any guidebook. The basilica held itself with a composure that suffering envies. I imagined the index below, adjusting its hems, murmuring quietare, quietare like a tired parent singing a lullaby to a house that does not know it is on fire in a polite way. You ask for climax. Here is mine. I no longer mistook mercy for laziness or laziness for mercy. I knew where the knives were kept and how carefully they were polished. I knew fear had been promoted to head librarian, and no one had signed the memo. I knew that light would return without my help, but that my small handles might keep 1,000 doors from jamming when it did. I have one confession left in this chapter, and it is the unhandsomest. I almost wrote erase. My pencil hovered over the card where a saint had been demoted to folklore so that a treaty could harden into pavement. My hand wanted to accuse the centuries aloud. Erase. In block letters, the way a frightened man shouts at a storm. I did not write it. Not because I lost courage, because the room has trained me to reserve certain words for Judgment Day. I wrote return instead, and slid the card back into a drawer that pretends to be for rope. Perhaps that is all the revolution a tired clerk can manage without breaking the furniture. When I lay down, I practiced the 13th. Count 12 custody, harmony, translation, delay, and rest your finger where the number would be if we were honest. In that space, new weather gathered soft rain, the kind that insists and forgives at once. Sleep came late, and when it came, it did not excuse me. It delivered a small dream with impeccable minutes. A bench in a square that no map owns yet, a child climbing up with a book, and an old man my age, and everyone's who says, very gently, ask me again. I did not leave the archives with a trumpet. I left with a match. It was the smallest mercy the room could safely allow. A single stick of flame, unremarkable as a pencil, given with no ceremony I could quote. I held it in my palm and felt the fiction of warmth, the way a promise heats your skin before it lets you know what it will cost. It was enough to see a step, not a staircase. Enough to illuminate the hinge, not the door. Enough, as it turns out, to write this. Brother Matteo retired to a room with a window that watched the hours practice their posture. He left me his black ink of the seal with the shrug of a man passing you a secret he is tired of carrying like an organ that never learned to sing. Use it to remember, he said. Use it to apologize to the future without writing the word sorry. We did not hug. Men who have kept keys together learn to part like furniture calmly, with a respect for the angles that kept the weight from breaking the floor. On my last night below last, not because the church dismissed me, but because the rooms did I walked the undercity, as if I were saying goodbye to a patient who never believed in recovery but always kept the bed made. The reading room of the unread yawned like a polite lion. The double calendar slept with one eye open. The index of forgetting adjusted its hems, whispering quiet air to itself the way an old singer hums scales after the show. The astrarium counted 12, and then held its breath, where the 13th insists on existing without owning a number. I set my match against that pause, and the flame did not burn. It listened. The winder joined me, as if drawn by the sound a listening flame makes. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. "The rooms have asked me to take a walk," I answered. He nodded. "Rooms cannot walk," he said. "They recruit legs." "What should I carry?" I asked, though I already knew. "Windows, benches, handles," he said. "Leave the furniture square when you can. When you cannot, write a sentence that will teach a stranger how to shim a chair without asking permission." He pressed a small metal disc into my hand, no larger than a coin, lighter than regret. On one side, the eye of the 13th, engraved by someone who loved circles more than peace. On the other, a single verb, return. "It's not a key," he said. "It's an apology you can keep in your pocket." I climbed, match cupped, coin warming, pockets suddenly meaningful. At the landing where chained books pretend not to dream of migration, the reliquaries cleared their throats with the courtesy of elders who approve but will never say so aloud. The thorn offered a date like a blessing. The veil declined to wave goodbye, and therefore said more than any flourish could have managed. A ring remembered hands, a staff splinter remembered water. Each object did what living witnesses rarely manage. It let me go. Upstairs, Rome rehearsed mourning with the stamina of a choir that understands audience better than doctrine. I crossed the square where tourists collect proof that their eyes have touched what other eyes touched. Pigeons curated treaties with fountains old enough to know scandal from style. A guard noticed the dust on my shoes and decided my guilt was probably liturgical. "Busy?" he said. "Listening," I said, and he saluted the way a man salutes a rumor he is willing to protect. I rented a room with a modest window and a desk that would forgive ink. I placed my match in a saucer and taught it not to burn the paper. A friend brought me bread. Another brought me sleep as a suggestion, which I politely declined. I began to write the parts of this confession that do not bruise the dark, the oaths that keep syntax alive, the manners by which a century leans, the verbal furniture that turns postponement into a liturgy. Relocate, translate, harmonize, delay. And the one verb the room would not use, but the angel instructed me to carry like medicine. Return. I wrote about fear, which had been promoted to head librarian while we were filing hymns. I wrote about mercy, which sometimes disguises itself as laziness so that decent men can sleep without learning how to apologize. I wrote about the bench, the smallest architecture of welcome, the furniture of access. I wrote a recipe for handles that could be carved into sentences, leave a missing verse in a chant, leave a margin too large to trim, leave a metaphor that invites fingers, teach the reader to put a shoulder to the hinge when the door decides to remember how to open. Then the letters began. They arrived from pilgrims who could not find the turn that their grandparents swore lived like a cat at the foot of a ruined wall. From widows whose anniversaries had been displaced to a day that the calendar claimed did not exist. I know I loved him then, one wrote. And so the day exists because love includes calendars in its jurisdiction. From teachers who lost students to a sermon that traded curiosity for silence and sent them home with excellent behavior. From a gardener who found, under an old paving stone in a courtyard most guides forget, a name written in black ink that refuses to fade. From a child who drew me a map of her city and marked every bench with a star because benches are where questions rest when grown-ups breathe. I kept the letters in shoeboxes, labeled with verbs. Listen, ask, return, teach. Some nights I shuffled them until a catechism appeared. Q. What if the date I was given does not fit my memory? A. You are not wrong. Some dates are costumes. Wear your memory under them and breathe. Q. How do I speak to a priest who prefers minutes to truth? A. Tell him you brought a shim for his chair, then ask where he keeps the windows. Q. How do I find a city the maps refuse to print? A. Walk its verbs. Erode, deposit, argue. Streets lie less than paper. Q. What do I do with fear? A. Promote curiosity. Demote fear. Give fear a bench outside and a cup of water. It will tidy itself while you read. I returned often, perhaps too often, to the square, where no map will yet admit a bench I commissioned in cash and secrecy. A carpenter with unambitious hands built it without asking why the wood wanted to face a wall that does not photograph well. I carved a word into the underside. Later, and left the match there, cold, a light for whichever child decides that underthings and hidden edges deserve to be climate-controlled by human attention. I do not own the bench. No one should own benches. As the months unscrolled, rumors learned my address. Some were kind, some were architecture wearing anger as scaffolding. One said I had forged a century and then taught it to apologize. Another said I had found a gospel and given it to a girl who refused to stop asking what verbs do to a soul. The rumor I liked best came from a baker. He said the 13th tick had begun to sound like someone putting bread in the oven late at night, a correction arriving with heat and forgiveness. When Matteo died, quietly, as men who have kept too many minutes often do, the rooms did not send notice. The notice was a name that would not stay shelved, appearing in the obituaries and then politely removing itself. The funeral homily was legible. The silence after was true. I went back under the city and left a slip of paper in the drawer that pretends to be for rope. Record, delay, translate, harmonize, reassign, quieten, return. I underlined the last verb with the black ink of the seal and wiped my pen the way a doctor wipes a blade he hopes never to use again. The listening room consented once more to what we must call presence only because we have so few words for accurate mercy. The angel, or whatever we agree to name what light does when it refuses to forget, kept its wings where grammar could not damage them. "I have a question," I said, careful to arrange humility on my tongue. "Ask," said the witness. "Is remembering a form of disobedience?" "It depends on the owner of the calendar," the witness said. "If obedience means sleep, then yes, remembering wakes the room. If obedience means custody, then remembering is the job." "What is the correct volume for memory?" I asked, because I had heard the presider prefer minimal harm and I wanted something with which to argue gently. "Lo," said the witness. "Memory is most durable when it hums. Humming is a key. People will match it without being told to sing." "Then give me a hum to bring upstairs," I said. The witness obliged. "I cannot write it. I can tell you what it did." Flowers I had not bothered to name decided to trust the balcony. A woman on a tram put a finger to her book and smiled at the stop where she used to cry. A boy returned a library book and discovered the librarian had hidden a map in the pocket with the stamp, a map that agreed to disagree with the official atlas just enough to teach him walking. Somewhere, the winder turned his key, and the 13th listened with its eye closed and did not need to blink. I started to visit schools, not to oppose anyone, to model benches. I would ask for 7 minutes at the end of a lesson and spend 5 of them teaching the wrist trick. Count 12 with the polite rhythm of clocks. Then rest your finger where 13 would sit if truth owned the furniture. In the pause, I told them, ask a question that embarrasses fear. If the skin hums, write it down and give it a window. The teachers looked at me like men look at rain that did not ask their permission to bless the field. The students understood at once. Children are 13th literate. A committee sent a letter requesting that I cease the practice of informal catechesis. The letter was legible, charitable, exquisitely timed to arrive on a day when I could afford to decline. I declined with minutes of my own, brief, courteous, principled, and equipped with handles. "I am not teaching doctrine," I wrote. "I am teaching custody. A calendar that cannot host questions is a locked drawer. Locked drawers invite the wrong locksmiths. 1. Sometimes I dream the index of forgetting as a field instead of a cabinet. Names grow like sturdy winter flowers. Cards migrate like birds and return because the bench remembers how to warm a feather without the arrogance of a cage. The field is watched by a clock with 12 marks and a 13th that is a window instead of an eye. The window opens if you hum. This is not metaphor so much as instruction disguised as weather. I have taken you as far as a match can go without becoming a lecture. If you would sleep now, close your eyes and let the hum continue the work. If you are awake and want the call to action you were promised, I will give it with the tenderness of an old clerk learning how to trust children with the archive. Do not stop asking questions. Ask them quietly if noise would break chairs. Ask them publicly if a door requires witnesses to remember how to open. Ask them the way a bench asks for company, the way a window asks for weather, the way a map asks for walking. Learn the verbs of your street. If a date does not fit your memory, keep your memory and fit the date to it later. If a saint disappears, say their name and vowels, and give a widow the courtesy of a day that will learn to exist because love does not cede jurisdiction to clerks. Remember this, because the angel asked me to say it, and I promised with a pen that does not fade. Memory returns. It is not a threat. It is a season. The most dangerous thing for those who prefer obedient centuries is not scandal or revolt. It is your memory coming back. If you need something to hold while it does, I have left handles in the margin of a hymn, in the pocket of a library book, under the bench that faces a wall that refuses to perform, on the reverse of a coin with an eye where a number should be. The map fragment in my coat has stopped pretending to be shy. It knows its shoreline. It has learned the names of birds. Before I blow out the match I never lit, I will give you a last instruction disguised as kindness. When someone tells you the door never opened, ask which door. Then, with the wrist the winder taught us, rest your finger where 13 almost is. If your skin hums, you have permission. If it does not, you have time. Both are gifts. Sleep now, if you wish. The reliquaries are murmuring again the low housekeeping of holy objects. They are not telling you what to believe. They are telling the walls your name, very gently, returning it to the page it belonged to all along. When you wake, take the match. Light nothing with it. Use it to listen, then walk out and teach a bench to face the wind.